of the day. So please make her incredibly welcome to the stage. It's Amy Hupe, everyone. Amy!
Yeah, I just had a pastry like 10 minutes before I came on stage, and my esophagus is making some weird noises. So I'm sorry if that happens. Yeah, so I also realised from Phil's introduction and the advertising that they have asterisked out all of the swearing from the title of my talk in all the advertising, and I haven't done that. So sorry in advance. Hope that's okay. So yeah, for those of you who are wondering who on earth I am, my name is Amy. I am a consultant based in the UK. And I specialise in two main areas. So the first one is content design, and the second one is design systems. And it's actually sort of the intersection of these two things that I'm going to talk to you about today. So documentation, that's kind of where I think those two things meet. I have worked, as Phil mentioned again, for the GovUK design system. I've also worked for Babylon Health, for BT, which is also EE and PlusNet, and more recently for Springer Nature. And so I've worked on design systems across those organisations over the last kind of 7 years or so. But I wanted to first just tell you a bit of a story about how I've ended up here today. So it all began at FFConf in 2022. Was anybody here there? Ooh, yeah, lovely. And that's where I met Josh, who is the organiser of today. And so the night before the conference began, Josh found himself kind of wandering around the streets of Brighton, making him sound a bit weird, aren't I? And happened upon our table. So I was sitting with Stu Robson, who's in the audience somewhere, who I was working with at the time, hello, and also our colleague Hayden Pickering. And I think Josh recognised Hayden's trademark moustache from Twitter and asked if he could join our table for a drink. So Josh and I had what I would personally describe as a kind of instant, very powerful connection. Would you agree? Shaking his head. Yeah. Not sure. And so, yeah, so we kind of hung out a little bit, watched talks, had a nice time. And then on the last night, after kind of 2 days of that and sort of heavy networking, we found ourselves kind of chatting at the drinks reception about how we were getting home the next day. And it just so happened that I was actually heading here to Leeds to see some friends. And Josh, sort of as you do, just blurted out, oh, you know, I live in Leeds. And immediately after he said it, he had what I can sort of only describe as a look of sheer terror pass over his face when he realised that he had disclosed this information and started telling me, oh, you know, but my train's very early, so I'll be, just, you know, tired or something. So, yeah, I get it, right? 2 full days spent in the company of lots of people, one of them me. You're just tired, aren't you? And you obviously need a bit of a break and just some downtime to recharge. And I hadn't booked my train home at that point, so I was kind of thinking, do I crash Josh's journey? And I was like, no, I shouldn't. That would be really bad. I hadn't really organised my journey. So I was really torn, but I just thought, no, I can't do it to the guy. It would be so harsh. And then I thought, fuck it. So we did get the train together. And as you can see from this photo, it turned out to be quite joyous for the both of us. Josh answered my endless torrent of questions about his work, his life, his family. Say hi to Sal for me, that's his mum. And a lovely time was had by all. So yeah, after eventually kind of resigning himself to my chatter without his AirPods, he pacified me by asking if I wanted to speak at All Day Hey. So here I am, absolutely delighted to be here and crack on with the talk. So yes, I need to let you know up front, as I kind of alluded to at the start, there is going to be sarcasm and swearing in this talk. If you are of a sensitive disposition about those things, there's not really anything we can do about that now. Here we are. Hopefully I won't be too offensive. You also might be wondering about the title of my talk. So why do we want to write shit documentation? Well, not good documentation. We'll get to that in a few moments, but I am going to start us off with an exercise just to bring some energy into the room. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you talk to anyone. You have all been furnished with a pen and a piece of paper, which you should find somewhere around your seat. You lot might be out of luck. I'm not sure if we ran out. If you, yeah, oh, you look like you have got some. If not, then just use the notes app on your phone or something. So if you could grab your pen and paper, I'm going to give you a set of instructions. Okay. Lovely. Mixed expressions about being made to do work at this juncture in the day. It'll be fun, Okay. So Right, I'm going to give you 7 instructions. Number 1, please draw an oval on your piece of paper. Lovely. Can you now draw a triangle coming out of the right-hand side of the oval? Okay, now, please, on top of the oval, can you draw a sideways letter B with the back of the B touching the oval? Some of you are looking really perplexed by this. Where is she going? Okay. Now, can you draw 3 thick lines going across the oval? Okay, now on the left-hand side of the oval, can you draw a C shape on its side? Nearly there. Above the C shape, can you now draw 2 dots side by side? And last one. Now can you draw 6 straight lines coming out from the bottom of the oval? Okay. Lovely. So I'm hoping that you've drawn something like this. Can you hold up your drawings for me? Wow. Yeah. Okay, something's looking like bees, something's looking horrifying. Yeah. I'd love you to tweet me a picture of what you've drawn so I can see. Okay. All right, we've all enjoyed the bees. Now I'm going to carry on talking. So, why did this happen? What was wrong? What went wrong here? So why did we all end up with different drawings? Why did you not all draw the same thing there? So I think one reason is that it was really obvious to me that I was asking you to draw a bee. So I drew the bee myself and I wrote down the steps that I took to get to that bee. But a really big difference between me and you here is that I knew that my end goal here was a picture of a bee, and I didn't tell you that, right? So I also didn't ask you anything about your skills and your knowledge. So I didn't say, you know, do you know how to draw? Are you comfortable drawing? Do you know what a bee looks like? Have you ever seen a bee before? And if we also look at these instructions and the drawings that you made when you followed them, then we can see gaps. So for instance, I didn't tell you which way round the oval should go. So some of you drew it portrait, some of you drew it landscape. And at step 4, I asked you to draw 3 thick lines going across the oval, but I didn't tell you whether they should be horizontal or vertical. And I can see that we've done both across the audience. So there was this kind of inbuilt room for error and inconsistency here. And I think the reason that these kind of gaps exist in our documentation and creep into our documentation is because of something called the curse of knowledge. So the curse of knowledge is a type of bias that we get when we've kind of built up a certain amount of experience and knowledge about a particular topic, whether that's drawing bumblebees or installing a piece of software or using a design system or anything else. Once we've reached the point of knowing something well, which is usually where we've got to at the point that we're documenting it, it becomes really difficult to put ourselves in the shoes of a person who doesn't have that same level of knowledge and information that we have. And I often think here about a quote from a friend and colleague of mine, somebody called Caroline Jarrett, who is a forms and survey specialist. And she says, we cannot judge if something is both clear and correct. If we know it well enough to say that it's correct, then we know it too well to say that it's also clear. And I want you to keep this in mind today as we go through this talk, because this is one of the most important foundations for documentation. So good documentation helps people to find and contribute to and use our products. And this is really important because this is what helps people understand and influence them. And the more people that can use and influence our products, the more those products are able to cater to a broad set of needs and experiences. And I think this is important because the tech industry has a problem with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or indeed a distinct lack of it. It's why 90% of teams in the tech industry still look like this. So the teams that build our websites and applications are still overwhelmingly white, young, cis, non-disabled, and male. And it's my belief that good documentation is inclusive, and it absolutely cannot completely solve all of those problems because they are systemic, big problems, but I firmly believe that it is a powerful tool in our arsenal to help mitigate and counteract some of those problems. So given all that, why on earth am I advising you to write shit documentation? Why am I recommending that given everything that I just said? Well, an important premise here is that the lack of diversity, equity, and inclusion in our industry is a problem worth solving. And this is a value that I've held on to throughout my kind of 7 years or so working in this space. It's something that I've strived to bring to the table in any role that I've done, whether I've been managing a design system or working as a tech writer or content designer. I've always tried to hold on to that principle. But then, in November last year, all of that changed. I was lucky enough to come across this stunning thought piece by Basecamp CEO and all-round legend, David Heinemeier Hansson. Who read this? Stick your hand up if you read this. Did you love it? Hands all? Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to warn you up front, this piece is a little bit challenging, but we've got plenty of time to dig into David's ethos as we go through the talk. So, in the article, David explains that diversity, equity, and inclusion is in fact so embarrassingly 2020 that we should just collectively reject it and instead return to the fail-safe and completely unproblematic concepts of meritocracy and colourblindness and natural equality of opportunity. So the sturdiness of these concepts ensure that they will prevail over our misguided attempts to make our industry and therefore our products more representative. Now, you might be thinking that maybe it's a bit too convenient for David, who is, on the face of it, a relatively mediocre white guy, to be arguing against diversity, equity, and inclusion. But he does actually address this head on. He says, it turns out that the central premise of diversity, equity, and inclusion, that discrepancies between demography statistics and employment reality is de facto proof of discrimination, is simply false. Yeah, quite hard to pass, that sentence, but the sense in it, I think you'll agree, is undeniable. So imagine what a silly sausage I felt when I read that. So inspired by David's profound wisdom, I have now decided to abandon my efforts to write accessible and inclusive documentation and turn my hand instead to a new endeavour. I've realised that writing shit documentation helps us to protect our knowledge and make ourselves indispensable to the organisations who employ us. And so from this point onwards, my mission is to create documentation that excludes and confounds and frustrates people and rendering it completely unusable. So today I'm going to walk through 5 principles that will help you to achieve the same. Now, these principles are based on my 7 years working at the intersection of design systems and content design, are inspired by David's wisdom, and will stand you in good stead. I can't even say it with a straight face. in what I hope you'll agree is a worthy pursuit. So they are as follows. Don't do user research. Make sure no one can find your docs. Organise documentation by audience type and not task. Do not get clear on documentation scope and type, and write in the passive voice. So let's start from the top. Don't do user research. Now remember how I talked about the curse of knowledge? Well, user research helps us to counterbalance that curse of knowledge. So if we can invite and understand different perspectives, then we create this kind of opposing force to that inbuilt bias that we carry. We give our users the job of determining whether what we've written is clear and effective. It also helps us to make sure that we're being time and cost efficient, in that we know, if we know what information our users actually need, then we only create the content that we actually need. We only have to maintain the content that we actually need. We're not creating unnecessary excess. So there are different stages of a product's life cycle, right? And as your product matures, I have found that the methods for researching and testing documentation needs to change at different stages of that life cycle. So let's just look at these in a bit more detail. So if we were aiming to create good documentation, which again, we're not, the very first thing that we would want to do is to understand more about the people who are going to be reading it. So for this, I typically conduct semi-structured interviews with a cross-section of people in the organisation to understand things like their level of knowledge about the thing that we're documenting, or how they work and what processes they follow, what kind of tools they're using, where they go to find documentation today, and how they best process and understand information. During this stage, I like to pay really sort of close attention to the language that people use to describe whatever it is that we're documenting. So this will help us when it comes to naming either kind of individual pieces of documentation or sections within that documentation, as well as category naming and overall information architecture. And once we've done that, once we've discovered some basic information about our users, we then want to test our early assumptions about the content and organisation of our documentation. So at this stage, I like to use things like card sorting, tree testing, or usability testing of wireframes to really understand whether we're moving in the right direction in terms of how we're naming and grouping our documentation. So the objective, I think, at this stage is to keep design relatively low fidelity, allowing our users to just focus on the content at hand first and foremost, and also preventing us from spending too much time perfecting our designs before we've really validated the overall approach. Once we've established a kind of level of confidence in this, then we should have enough information to start actually writing our documentation. And at this stage, we need to do user research that really concentrates on validating that our documentation is fulfilling its purpose. And the best way that I found to do this is to test the findability and the efficacy of individual pieces of documentation with task-based usability testing. So for example, if you're writing an installation guide, get someone to try and install the software in question. Don't just get them to read it, like see if they can actually use it. And when I'm doing this, I like to make notes using a sort of traffic light system where we identify red issues, so that's times where participants were completely unable to complete the task or part of a task without intervention. Amber issues, which are times when participants were still able to complete the task, but they encountered friction or they expressed frustration or confusion. And then green issues, so times when participants were able to complete the task with relative ease. If we repeat these exercises with several users with different levels of experience and seniority and background knowledge and with different roles and things, it helps us to build up a really clear picture of the problem areas and the iterations that we need to make to our documentation. To return to my earlier point, user research helps us counterbalance the curse of knowledge. So if your goal was to write good documentation, then everything that I've just described will stand you in good stead. But as David reflects, it really has been a crazy couple of years in the throes of Celatry. Oh, goodness. And it's just time that we put this madness to bed. So instead of wasting our time understanding what users need, we can take a different and altogether more efficient approach. I propose that we rebrand the curse of knowledge to the gift of knowledge and protect it at all costs. Wield a scarcity mindset. Make yourself indispensable by ensuring that you and only you can understand and operate the products that you make. And to reinforce this, we can move on to principle number 2. Make sure no one can find your docs. There is a GIF on the next slide. It is moving. If you are sensitive to GIFs, please shut your eyes now. I suspect that we've all worked in organisations who couldn't settle on a single documentation tool. So this is very, very common in large organisations, and the end result is usually documentation that lives across multiple different destinations, usually with no particular rhyme or reason for living in the place that it does. And if we were looking to create good documentation, which obviously we no longer are, then we would work to bring intention to these journeys. So we can't necessarily get rid of the use of multiple tools. It's normally something that we're kind of stuck with within our organisations, but we can certainly map our existing information architecture to understand where our content intersects and to create logical routes through our documentation. And this is where user research provides us with a really strong foundation. So it can help us to understand where people will go to look for documentation and the terms that they'll use to search for it. Now, I've adapted this quote from something that Sarah Drummond, who, if you don't know her, she's a service designer and she was co-founder of the service design agency Snook, once said, which is that service design is mostly brownfield most of the time, so not greenfield. And I think the same is true of information architecture. So we're pretty much never working with a blank canvas. We're never working in a kind of greenfield landscape when it comes to information architecture, because organisations start creating documentation from their very inception. So we have to find ways to navigate our way through this kind of messy landscape. And this means being cognizant that our documentation may overlap with other existing documentation, and then doing the work to reconcile any repetition and create journeys through related information. So for example, when we started creating documentation for the GovUK design system, we weren't doing it in a vacuum. So we knew that parts of our documentation were going to overlap with other existing resources that were being used and being maintained by people at GDS and government service teams. So we had the GovUK service manual, which is a comprehensive but fairly sort of high-level guide to creating government services. We had the GovUK content style guide, which is for content writers and publishers working in government. We had a federated collection of design patterns, which was kind of community-led and driven, documented in Dropbox or Hackpad as it was then. And we also had a precursor to the GovUK design system called GovUK Elements. So some of this was relatively easy to deal with. We just reviewed all the docs in Hackpad and in Elements and migrated everything that was still relevant and useful into the design system and deleted anything that we didn't need anymore. So for these resources, the GovUK design system became a direct replacement and we were able to get rid of them. But in the case of the service manual and the GovUK content style guide, the purpose and audience for this documentation that lived there overlapped with what we needed, but it wasn't quite the same. These resources were owned and maintained by different teams, and we needed them to continue to exist alongside the GovUK design system. So we had to work with their owners and maintainers to negotiate which documentation we would need to own and which would remain under their control. We then created links at relevant points in the documentation to hand people off to related information in the other resources where it made sense to do that. So it's not always possible or even sensible to have one home for all of your documentation, but it is important to bring intention to the journeys through different destinations. Another principle for good documentation, which I hesitate to remind you we are not in pursuit of, is to let people look for information using words and phrases that they actually know. So when we're creating good documentation, it's so important that we try and use the language that our users already use and we don't just invent new terminology for the sake of it. One way that we did this in the GovUK design system is that we built aliases into our search. So this let people search for things using the name that they knew for them, whilst giving them a kind of gentle nudge towards the official name that we had given it. We also then tracked these search terms over time to learn whether we were actually using the right names in the first place. And if we found a search term being used very commonly, then we would often rename the pattern or the component to support the common name. But I am getting carried away again. It is important that we do instill barriers to findability, lest we find ourselves obliterated by the DEI train as it tears through our industry, pulverising the meritocracy in its merciless pursuit of its outcomes-based, ratio-obsessed equality of outcomes. Perish the thought. With this in mind, I reiterate my second principle. Make sure no one can find your docs. Bury them in a baffling lasagna of information. Oh God, you dare write this quite late at night. Use different tools to create mystery and misdirection. Build a moat around the castle of your wisdom and keep the enemies out. Okay, so another way to do this is with principle number 3. Organise documentation by audience type, not task. Now, a common practice that I see with design system teams in particular is teams sorting their documentation according to the type of person that they expect to be reading it, rather than the task that that person is trying to do. So an example of this is creating documentation for developers and documentation for designers. This is very common, so absolutely no disrespect to anybody who is doing that, but here are some reasons why I think this is problematic. First off, although we often aspire to have the kind of perfect ratio of designers and developers across our products, in my experience, we often end up with an imbalance, which often leads to people performing hybrid roles. So let's actually test this out. Put your hand up if you are a developer. Okay. Oh, most of you. Okay, great. I suppose it is a tech conference, isn't it? Keep your hands up. Put your hand down. No, sorry, excuse me. Keep your hand up if your role involves or has ever involved doing some design tasks as part of your work. Okay, so I'd say that's most of you. Okay, put your hand up if you're a designer. Okay. Keep your hand up if your role involves or has ever involved doing some developer tasks or technical tasks. All your hands stayed up, great. Yeah, so, and just for fun, stick your hand up if you're like me and you've got no idea what your job is anymore and you're just doing a mishmash of different things and hoping that nobody finds out. Great, good. Yeah, you are my people. Come find me at the pub later, I'll buy you a drink. So people perform hybrid roles, and that's one reason why sorting documentation by audience type can be counterintuitive. And another reason is that sorting documentation by role is difficult, is because even when we do have defined job roles, our tasks will often overlap with other people's tasks in their roles. So, for example, if we stick with the scenario of a designer and a developer using a design system, and we think about how we might document, say, the usage guidance for a button, it's always a button, some things are pretty clear cut. So it's probably a safe bet that guidelines on how to configure the button in Figma, for example, is mostly only relevant for designers. And we can probably make an assumption that information like how to set the button's properties in production is only applicable to developers. But what about guidance on when to use different button variants in the first place, for example? Can we always be 100% confident that it's a designer who's making those decisions? And what about things like focus states or accessible colour contrast ratios, or whether or not we should use disabled buttons? Don't. Do these decisions all fall neatly to either a designer or a developer, or is the water a bit muddier there? Because in my experience, the line is often blurred between these things. Different designers that I've worked with have kind of varying expectations about the remit of their control over the, minutiae of component behaviour, and developers will often fill gaps in prototypes with their own design decisions. So if we know that tasks cannot always be kind of neatly attributed to a single role, then we end up having to hedge our bets and include necessary information in multiple different places that are designed for different audiences. And this means not only writing that guidance more than once in the first place, but also maintaining separate instances of it and making sure that each instance stays in sync with every other instance. And you don't have to scale this very much to find yourself in content maintenance hell. And this is really difficult because tech writers and people whose job it is to look after documentation are still very much a luxury and a rarity in tech teams. So the result is that it becomes everybody's job and therefore nobody's job. Information falls out of sync and out of date, and we create confusion and failure demand, having to provide hands-on support to mitigate the shortcomings of our documentation. So the solution to this would be to organise content by task or even topic instead of audience. Even if the task seems specific to a certain user group, we can think about what it is that group is trying to do rather than who they are. So to return to the WK design system, we decided to frame our kind of onboarding guides as getting started with prototyping and getting started in production rather than a guide for designers and a guide for developers. So this meant we were able to kind of make space and acknowledge developers who were building prototypes and designers who were working in production without shoehorning them into this kind of arbitrary classification that might not actually reflect their day-to-day reality. So this approach is undoubtedly more inclusive for different people and contexts and experiences. But again, we must heed David's warnings. These misguided efforts only contribute to the torching of previous principles of equality. The principles that I'm sure we're all thankful afforded Davo his net worth of $40 million. It's time we say no more to this radical, raging rebellion. and force our users to conform to our one-dimensional archetypes. Reject diversity, embrace homogeny and hegemony, and typify people with wild abandon and sort your documentation accordingly. I'm really hoping one of these gets like tweeted out of context. So it's the end of my career. Cool. So principle number 4, don't get clear on documentation scope and type. Now, you've probably heard people say that naming things is hard, right? We love to say that. Whether it's a product or a service or a piece of content or documentation, working out what to call the things that we produce seems to be this kind of perpetual challenge that we have. But what I've found over and over is that naming challenges are nearly always scoping challenges in disguise. So when we're struggling to name a piece of documentation, it's often because we're not yet clear on its purpose and where it kind of begins and ends. So I run training on design system documentation, on writing design system documentation, and this is one of the exercises that I do to illustrate this. So we talk about naming components, and I'm going to ask you to name some components for me. There's only 3. This won't go on for too long. So please feel free to just shout out the answer. Let's start with what I think is an easy one. What would you call this component?
Fred.
Fred, yeah. Thanks, mate. Anyone but Dave, what would you call this component? A button, yeah, lovely, great. What about this one? Radios, lovely. Okay, what about this? Okay, so yeah, search box people say. So this last example is usually the one, so in the training I get them to all answer kind of anonymously in like a retro board. And this is always the one that divides people, because when we're thinking about documenting something complex like search, we often default to different ideas about where it begins and ends. So is this actually a dedicated search component, or is it in fact a text input with a button and an icon? Or is it indeed a search flow pattern? If it's that, then we probably also want to document things like the results page and the way that we display links and pagination and other constituent parts that comprise the experience of searching for something within our website and our applications. If we're trying to write good documentation, then we need to get super clear on the scope of what we're writing so that we can create clarity and set expectations about the purpose of each piece of documentation. And once we're clear about that scope of the information that we need to communicate, then we also need to be clear about what type of documentation we're providing. So broadly speaking, there are 4 types of documentation described in the diataxis framework as tutorials. So these are lessons that help someone learn a practical skill rather than theoretical knowledge. We've got how-to guides, which are instructions that take someone through the steps to achieve a specific goal or outcome. We then have explanation documentation, which is usually just broad information that helps people to understand the kind of topic of an area without necessarily a set goal. And then we have reference documentation, which is succinct guidance that describes what something is and how it works. So sticking to one of these documentation types for each piece of documentation is a good rule of thumb. So if we look at the B exercise that we did at the beginning of this talk, that would fall into the category of a how-to guide. And it probably would have been quite bizarre and tedious for you if I had included a lengthy explanation about what bees are, different types of bees, and a generic tutorial on how to hold a pencil. So the reason this matters is to do with kind of meeting our readers where they are and giving them all the information that they need to support their goal at that particular time and nothing more. And this means doing the hard work to understand our users and respecting their time with a clear and navigable experience. And this is a really good thing to aim for if our goal is to create good documentation. But I'm getting sidetracked again. Some of our documentation users may feel more pressured and more surveilled than others, and therefore more mindful of their time. But if we really want to sort the wheat from the chaff, then we need to cater to those who are already safe and well represented in our industry, with buckets of time to browse our documentation and decipher the information that they need. After all, as David reminds us, Americans still support equality of opportunity, and they still reject equality of outcomes. So, on to my final principle for writing shit documentation. Write in the passive voice. Now, this one's kind of specific, but time and time again, I see documentation being written in the passive voice, and I want to explain why it's a problem. So first of all, let me just explain what I mean. The active voice tells you who is doing what. So for example, this talk is being watched is a passive statement. An active version of that statement is, you are watching this talk. Our contribution guidelines must be followed is a passive statement. An active version of that would be, you must follow our contribution guidelines. There were endless proclamations of doing the work. This is a quote from David's article. That's a passive statement. An active statement would be, David is talking out of his arsehole. Just a random example. So, the active voice is easier for us to read and remember, whereas the passive voice is ambiguous and it's harder to parse. They've actually done a study, which I must remember I'll somehow tweet a reference to it or something, but there was a study done that showed that they showed them a bunch of participants, a bunch of kind of active statements and passive statements. And the ones that were passive, when they were asked to explain them back, they explained them back in active terms, which they kind of concluded meant that we process information in the active voice. So it's removing that kind of barrier for people. So the active voice also forces us to be specific. We have to say who is doing what, whereas the passive voice allows us to be kind of vague and a little bit waffly. The active voice also, and this is really important for documentation, makes instructions clear, whereas the passive voice makes instructions really easy to miss. The bottom line is that when you write in the passive voice, no one really understands what the fuck you're saying or who you're talking to. So this makes it hard for people to know what they have to do and really easy to miss instructions. And this may have been a problem a few years ago, but things are indeed quite different now. As David says, since those heady days of 2020, when diversity, equity and inclusion was famously invented, which means David heard about it then, things have changed. And this is where I want to leave you today. Write in the passive voice, shroud your documentation in mystery, leave them guessing. Just to recap, do not do user research. Do your best to make your documentation impenetrable. Make sure that absolutely no one can find it. Classify your audience arbitrarily and organise your documentation according to those classifications, not the task that it's designed to support. Don't get clear about documentation scope or type. Just throw everything in that you've got. YOLO. And finally, write in the passive voice. I will be sad to abandon my quest to support diversity, equity and inclusion with clear documentation. And I'm sure that you will too, but we must move on. I really want to thank David Heinemeier Hansen for inspiring this talk and calling this to my attention and boldly sticking his clever head above the parapet. Oh God, imagine if he was here to protect the status quo. Thanks, babes. Thank you all for listening.